historical linguistics. Philomena.
Thank you. I'm going to share my screen. Is that visible? Can anybody see my screen?
Yes.
Yes.
Fantastic. Excellent. My question for today is, did the Romans do historical linguistics? The short answer is yes, at least sometimes and to some extent. For some of the most interesting details, I refer you to a recent article by Nick Zare, which is on the bibliography, which I believe you can access via a link in the chat box. As an example, here's the first passage that Zare discusses. Everything I'm going to say about it comes from Nick's article. It's a passage of Varro. It starts with a quotation from Ennius containing the form kamenos. Kamenos is a restoration in that line, but it has to have been there for what follows to make sense. And then Varro claims that there's what he calls a priscum vocabulum, an old word, kasmenai, and that there's also a form carmenai. And he says in many words where the ancients used to say an S, an R was said afterwards. And he gives a few examples of that. This form, supposedly an early form of the imperative oborire, not exactly the earlier form we'd expect, but not far from it, an early form of melior, and then a whole series of pairs of forms where the earlier one contains an S and the later one contains an R. And most of these count as decent examples of Latin rhotacism for us as well. Not quite all of them, but most of them. And then he says, therefore, Casmena gave Carmena, and from Carmena, we got Camena with loss of the R. So there's a quite general observation about Latin. S's sometimes became R's over the course of time, and there's an attempt to make use of that as part of trying to reconstruct the phonological history of this form Camena. What's interesting, as Nick Zare points out, is that Camena can't really go back to Carmena, nor can Carmena really go back to Casmena. This is not one of the environments where, from our point of view, an S becomes an R in Latin, nor would an R in that position have just disappeared. Carmena appears to be posited on the basis of the meaning. Muses have something to do with singing, so perhaps the word Camena comes from something to do with Carmen, and this form Casmena would appear to be posited here on the basis of trying to work backwards, on the basis of the idea that R's sometimes come from S's. But there's a wrinkle, because Varro goes on to quote this line from something called the Carmen Priami, in which this form Casmenas allegedly occurs. And as Zare points out, if we can trust Varro on all this, then the attempt to reconstruct that form can't be attributed to Varro, but perhaps to the anonymous author of the Carmen Priami. And if all that's true, then it's not only Roman writers on language who attempted to reconstruct past stages of the language, forms belonging to past stages of the language, but on occasion, Roman poets might have done that as well. And that, of course, complicates any attempt to distinguish between forms that writers on language reconstructed on the one hand and forms that they might have found in literary sources on the other hand. Be that as it may, an awareness of the change of S to R as a diachronic change in Latin, a change that happens over time, continues in the later Latin grammatical tradition. It's not only Varro, although I think it's fair to say that Varro is a particularly historically minded Roman writer on language. So the short answer to my question is yes, at least sometimes and to some extent. My colleague Wolfgang de Melo, in his edition and commentary on Varro's De Lingua Latina, cautions against exaggerating the extent to which Varro was systematically doing something that's a sort of precursor to our historical linguistics, and that's very well taken. But what I'd like to do in this lecture is attempt a sort of Latin counterpart to the first lecture. In the first lecture, I raised the question, did ancient Greeks do things that we would consider to be historical linguistics? And I considered that question with reference to their discussions of vowel length in particular. Today, I'd like to consider whether Roman authors do things that would count as historical linguistics for us in connection with discussions of Latin vowel length in particular. This will be a challenge, or rather, I'm going to try to make the lecture comprehensible, but the subject is a challenge because it raises extremely thorny questions about what the history of the Latin vowel length system actually is. And much of this lecture will be a long digression through some of those issues, but we'll come to this question of historical linguistics in the end. Now, Latin is a language with a long attested history. And in Latin, as in Greek, there's a distinctive contrast of vowel length in its classical period, as opposed to the Greek classical period. Not even that bit is uncontroversial, but I'm going to be taking it to be the case that in classical Latin, there's a distinctive vowel length contrast. That contrast gets lost at some stage in the subsequent history of the language. Here's a fairly standard diagram of the classical Latin vowel system, such as you can find in a number of different works which are on the bibliography. And the way this diagram is often drawn, the long vowels have what's called a more peripheral articulation than the short ones. The long front vowels are more front than the short front vowels. The long back vowels are more back than the short back vowels. And the mid and high long vowels are higher than the mid and high short vowels. In other words, we get a bigger triangle when it comes to the long vowels than we do when it comes to the short vowels, although the triangles meet in the A vowels. Not everybody agrees that this more peripheral articulation for the long vowels is really there already in the classical period. That doesn't really matter for today's purposes, as long as at some stage there's this more peripheral articulation. It will be convenient, I think, to think of the classical Latin vowel system looking like that, but it doesn't actually matter if this bigger triangle arose at some point later. Now, at some stage, this distinctive contrast in vowel lengths, as I said, gets lost, and eventually the outcome in most Latin-speaking areas looks like this. That's to say, the long vowels don't simply merge with the orthographically identical short vowels, but long E merges with short I, and that's one of the reasons why it's convenient to think in terms of something like this diagram as the starting point, showing long E and short I not that different from each other in vowel quality before the difference in length has been lost. And long O and short U, again, merge with each other to give those two vowels. Long I and long U lose their length, but remain distinct vowels in the system. Short E and short O lose their distinctive shortness, but remain distinct vowels in the system, at least in stressed syllables. In unstressed syllables, things are more complicated under some circumstances. The A vowels are the only place where the long vowel really merges with the orthographically identical short vowel. That's in most Latin-speaking areas, but in some Latin-speaking areas, different things happen. In particular, in Sardinia, and probably in Africa, as argued by Adams, the long vowels simply merge with the orthographically identical short vowels. So we get what looks like a much more straightforward picture. In Romania, what happens to the front vowels is what happens in most Latin-speaking areas, but what happens to the back vowels is the same as what happens in Sardinia and probably in Africa. Now, that's a fairly standard picture, but it conceals a number of uncertainties and debates, and there are two questions in particular that have attracted attention. The first one is this: when the classical system of distinctive vowel quantity was lost, in the short term, what happened to the actual duration of vowels? There are two main views. Main view number one is that accented vowels in open syllables, accented vowels followed by no more than one consonant, were pronounced long, and all other vowels were pronounced short. So all unstressed vowels and vowels in closed syllables were pronounced short, and that's the system of so-called open syllable lengthening under the accent reflected in Romance languages. In recent years, a prominent proponent of this view is Michele Loporcaro. I'm delighted that he's here, by the way, and I hope that questions about the details of the Romance languages might be addressed to him in question time. Main view number two is that accented vowels were pronounced long and unaccented vowels were pronounced short regardless of the type of syllable. And in recent years, a prominent proponent of main view number 2 is Marco Mancini. Some references for both views are on the bibliography. I'm not going to be trying to solve this question today, although it will perhaps emerge obliquely from some of the things I'm going to say that I think this is an extremely difficult question, and perhaps even more difficult than it's sometimes been thought. I will say, though, that it's not clear to me that those two views are quite incompatible with each other, because it's quite conceivable that every vowel was pronounced longer if accented than that same vowel would have been pronounced if unaccented, but that difference was especially pronounced in open syllables. That was suggested by Straka in a book published in 1979, and Straka emphasizes the typological plausibility of that idea. Be that as it may, it will be enough for today to know that unaccented vowels came to be pronounced short and accented vowels came to be pronounced long, at least in open syllables. We can leave to one side the real problem, which is what happened to accented vowels in closed syllables, particularly because the grammatical texts I'd like to look at are not that interested in vowel length in closed syllables, because they're more interested in syllable quantity than vowel quantity. If a syllable is closed, they know that it's a heavy syllable or a syllable that scans long. That's what they're really interested in. The second big question is, by what date can we really say that the classical system of vowel quantity had been lost? I'd like to come back to that question in a while, but the texts I'd like to look at to begin with lend support to the idea that, to a large extent at least, and for most speakers, that system had largely collapsed by the 4th century AD, if not earlier. And I'd like to at least work with that as a sort of working assumption. Now, in the first lecture, I raised a version of this question for Greek. What happens if you've got a distinctive contrast between long and short vowels, and that contrast gets lost, but the vowels continue to be called long and short? That happened in Latin as it happened in Greek. And I suggested in the first lecture that there's a likely development and then there's a possible further step. And the likely development is that the words for long and short come to mean something different over time. The possible further step is that some people start asking themselves some questions like this. Why do we actually call the vowels long and short, given that we don't actually pronounce the long vowels any longer than the short vowels? And potentially, some people give some historical answers to that kind of question. Perhaps the long vowels were actually pronounced longer than the short ones at some point in the past. And if people do that, I'd say there's a bit of historical linguistic thinking there, particularly when it comes to the semantics of these words for long and short. If people are noticing that the way those words are being used in connection with vowels is not transparently related to the ordinary meaning of words for long and short. And if they start thinking, how might that have come about? Perhaps those vowels were at one point literally long and short. The main thing that I think happens in the Latin grammatical tradition as the distinctive vowel length contrast gets lost is this, that the words for long and short come to mean something different. Their meanings are transformed as the language changes around them. I'd like to take a look in a bit more detail at what that actually means for Latin. So what happens in late antique grammatical texts when they're talking about vowel length? Well, in general, late antique Latin grammarians consider vowels and syllables either long or short in the traditional way, but they sometimes acknowledge that what they're calling length is either difficult or impossible to hear directly. For example, the length of the I in the second singular present indicative of a verb like lego or audio is a standard way of talking about the difference between the third and the fourth conjugation. If you've got a short vowel there, you've got a third conjugation verb. If you've got a long vowel there, you've got a fourth conjugation verb. In fact, what we call the third and fourth conjugations are sometimes called the third short and the third long conjugation in Latin grammatical texts. But now and then, we see that we're being given some hints as to how we can actually know the length of the I, as if that's not something we can just easily hear. The first type of hint we can be given is consider the present active imperative or the infinitive, because if you've got a short I in your second singular present indicative, that will turn into an E when you get to the imperative. But if your I is long, then it's still an I when you get to the imperative, and similarly for the infinitive. A second type of hint that we can get is consider the first or second plural present indicative. Consider a form like legimus or legitis or audimus or auditis, because when you say those forms, you'll find that you can't produce them with an unnaturally short or long vowel unless you greatly distort them. What does that mean? Well, it means that what's being called the natural length of the vowel will just naturally come out when you try to say those words. What's meant by the natural length of the vowel? Late antique grammarians talking about the natural length of a vowel mean the length that that vowel had historic, or sorry, without suggesting that they're thinking of it in those terms, they mean the traditional length that's ascribed to that vowel, the length that that vowel, as it were, officially has in descriptions of Latin. Now, why is it that the traditional length naturally comes out when you say those words? Well, there's a historical account of that we can give. Consider a form like legimus. The I is short in classical Latin, and in classical Latin, vowels are distinctively long or short, so being short is just a property of that vowel. Because that vowel is short and it's in an open syllable, that means that the syllable is short or light, and when a penultimate syllable is short or light in Latin, the accent or the stress falls on the preceding syllable, as long as your word is at least 3 syllables long. So the accent will fall on that first syllable. By late antiquity, the distinctive vowel length contrast has been lost, but the accent or the stress remains where it is. But now that we're in late antiquity, that vowel will be lengthened under the accent, at least if it's in an open syllable, as it is there, and that unstressed vowel in the middle will be realized as short. So in late antiquity, that vowel is short because it's unaccented. In classical Latin, it's unaccented because it's short and it's in a penultimate open syllable. But the end result of all that is that the length with which that vowel is realized in late antiquity matches the classical Latin quantity of that vowel, but there's only an indirect relationship between the two. Similarly, but slightly differently, if we consider classical audimus, that I is distinctively long in classical Latin. Because it's long, it makes the syllable long. And since that's a penultimate syllable, it gets the accent because it's long. By late antiquity, the distinctive length contrast has been lost, but the stress remains where it is. And that vowel being under the accent, and at least if it's in an open syllable, which it is, it gets realized as long. So again, the length with which that vowel is realized in late antiquity matches the classical Latin quantity, but there's an indirect relationship between the two. In the late antique synchronic analysis we're seeing here, things are a bit simpler. We can say in a penultimate open syllable, by the way, I don't think they ever put it quite like that, but this is the idea. In a penultimate open syllable, the so-called natural quantity of a vowel manifests itself in actual pronunciation. You can actually hear the quantity as an actual length or shortness. This only works in penultimate open syllables. And by the way, that doesn't depend on who's right about this business of stressed closed syllables. It's in the nature of the thing that this is only going to work when we're talking about a penultimate open syllable. So the kind of exercise that we're being told to perform here is, if you want to know the quantity of a vowel, find a related form in which the vowel that you're interested in is in a penultimate open syllable, and then try saying the form, and you'll be able to hear if it's a long or short vowel from its actual length. A slightly more bizarre variant of this idea that if we want to know a quantity, we should get it into a penultimate open syllable comes from this anonymous late antique author. He's talking about quantities in the word armarium, meaning box. It's a long story whether he's really talking about vowel or syllable quantities, but the syllables he's particularly interested in are open syllables here, the second and the third syllable, and it will come to the same thing, whether we're talking about the vowel or the syllable there. And what do we have to do? Well, if we're interested in the ma syllable, that second syllable, lop off the final syllable of the word to leave this sequence of syllables armari, and then try saying that. And we'll be able to hear when we say that the A is a long vowel, because we're going to find that ourselves saying something like armari. If we're interested in the I or the ri, then we need to lop off the R at the beginning to leave marium. And by the way we say that, we'll know that the I is short. This is all rather curious, partly because it's not really necessary to lop off syllables from the beginning of the word if we want to know about the quantity in the penultimate syllable, because by the reasoning that we were just seeing before, we could have known the quantity of the penultimate syllable just by saying the whole word. And secondly, lopping off a syllable from the end is only going to help you if implicitly you already know what the quantity is of the syllable that you're looking for there. But be that as it may, the idea is lop off syllables from the beginning of the or the end of your word until the syllable you're interested in is the middle one of three. And the author says that you can do that not only with words with 4 syllables, but with words with 5 or more syllables. Just lop off enough syllables until the one you're interested in is the middle one of 3. Coming back to more mainstream territory, in this text we get an extended example of how to work out syllable quantities. In this text, the interest is in syllable quantities, but whenever the syllable is an open one, vowel and syllable quantities will come to the same thing. The word is amicissimorum. How do we know the length of the first syllable? Well, find a related word with that same syllable in, and find an example in a poet and see how it scans. And the example we're given is Virgil's Nimium dilexit amicum. The A of amicum scans short, so that will be short also in amicissimorum. For the second syllable, find a related form where that syllable is a penultimate syllable. And see if you put the stress on it. In this text, we're not told, see if you pronounce it long or short. We're told, see if you put the stress on it. Because if you put the stress on it, that will be a long syllable. And in fact, we do. We say amicus, so that's a long syllable. The next one is a long syllable because it's what they call long by position. It's what we call a closed syllable. The vowel is followed by 2 consonants. There's no interest in this text in working out the length of the vowel. Once we know the syllable is long, that's enough. To know the length of the next syllable, consider the related form amicissimus. The one we're interested in now is in the penultimate position, so we can see how we say it. Oh, we don't put the stress on that syllable, we put the stress on the preceding syllable, so that must be a light syllable or a short vowel there. To know the quantity of the next syllable, we can simply say the word amicissimorum itself. We'll find that we put the stress on that syllable, so that must be a long syllable and a long vowel. And then when it comes to the final syllable, we're going to need some rules for quantities in final syllables. And the text is going to go on to give us some rules for quantities in final syllables. So the point of this discussion here is to lead on to the next part of the text, where we're going to be instructed about quantities in final syllables. So the impression we get from all these texts we've been looking at is quantity is often difficult to hear. It's difficult or impossible to hear, but it remains important. And I think it remains important because in practice, what's being called length for vowels and syllables has become 2 things by the time we've got these late antique texts. Firstly, it's a learned feature ascribed to some syllables, which is held responsible for the fact that those syllables scan long in classical and classicizing poetry. And that's something that some of these texts are interested in. And secondly, it's become an abstract feature deployed in the description of the language as a whole. And by that, I mean something you can't necessarily hear directly, but you can hold it responsible for other things. In particular, the long value of a syllable is held responsible for the fact that that syllable attracts the accent if it finds itself in the penultimate position of a word. And secondly, the long or short value of a vowel can help to predict the inflectional patterns that a word form will enter into, as we saw with third and fourth conjugation verbs. And under some circumstances, that's when you're in a penultimate open syllable, abstract vowel length, this abstract feature that we're calling length, can be held responsible for literal length, that's to say actual duration. This, in which that's the case, is encouraged by the fact that the Latin words for long and short retain their literal meaning. In these grammatical contexts, when we're talking about vowels and syllables, the meaning has been transformed largely into something else, into something more abstract, but the words still literally mean long and short, and that can be considered relevant. Or to put it differently, I think that abstract length in late antique grammarians really is abstract length. It's not abstract something else. It's length that you can't necessarily hear, but under very particular circumstances, you might even be able to hear it as actual length. So that's what I think has happened on the whole to words for long and short in the Latin grammatical tradition. But I promised to come back to this question. By what date can we say that the classical system of vowel quantity has actually been lost? Discussions of this question often center on two authors of the 4th or 5th century AD who suggest that African Latin speakers have a particular difficulty with vowel quantity. One is St. Augustine in Book 4 of the De Doctrina Christiana, published in 426 AD. He says, why should a teacher of piety, like himself, for example, be reluctant to say ossum rather than os as the word for bone? Why should I be reluctant to use the lower register form rather than the high register form? In order to avoid a misunderstanding, that's to say, in order to avoid people thinking that it's the word for mouth. The word for mouth has a long O, this word for bone has a short O, but African ears do not discriminate, he says, with regard to the shortness and length of vowels. So Africans in particular have a difficulty about hearing the difference between short and long O. The other author is Consentius, probably writing in Gaul in the late 4th or the 5th century AD. He's talking about barbarisms, mistakes you can make in a single word. And he's giving an example here of barbarisms involving quantity. If you say the word piper, the word for pepper, with the first syllable long, although it's short. And he says that's a fault which is a habit of Africans. And then Consentius, again, giving another example, says if you say orator with the first syllable short, that's another barbarism. And that's, again, a fault that's peculiar to Africans. Now, on the face of it, there are two apparently obvious inferences. One is that even at this rather late date, Latin speakers outside Africa kept the classical Latin long and short vowels distinct, at least in the case of I and O, because these passages we were just looking about are all about I and O vowels. But if other speakers didn't keep them distinct, why do they single out Africans as having a particular difficulty with them? And the other apparently obvious inference is that in Africa, the classical vowel length contrasts had been replaced by a system in which accented vowels are pronounced long, at least in open syllables. Hence the idea that piper becomes piper, and unaccented vowels are pronounced short, hence the first unaccented vowel of orator being pronounced short. And yet, evidence for the collapse of the old vowel length contrast is by no means confined to Africa in the 4th and 5th centuries AD. And we've seen one type of evidence in those late antique texts that seem to suggest that length is often difficult or impossible to hear. And secondly, both of those inferences could in fact be correct without it following that what counted as length outside Africa was always duration as such. Consider again the outcome of the eventual loss of the distinctive vowel length contrast in most Latin-speaking areas on the one hand, and in Sardinia and probably Africa on the other hand. In most Latin-speaking areas, what they call long E, the vowel that comes from classical long E, is still distinct in pronunciation from what they call short E, at least in stressed syllables and to some extent in unstressed syllables. It's not distinct in length, but it's still a different vowel sound. And similarly, long I is still a distinct vowel sound from what they call short I. And similarly with the long and short U vowels and with the long and short O vowels, it's only for the A vowels that the orthographically identical long and short vowels have merged. So it's possible for most Latin-speaking areas that when they talk about long O, for example, what they mean is the vowel we spell with an O that we pronounce like that. When they talk about short U, they mean the vowel we spell with a U that we pronounce like that, and so on. But in Africa, if this is correct, there is no distinction in vowel quality or anything else between what we call long E and what we call short E, and so on. And perhaps that's where the special the special inability of Africans to hear the difference between something like long O and short O comes from. Is that why we can't hear the difference between os and os, for example? Now, the three short passages we were just looking at all mention errors of quantity, an error of perception in this instance, and errors of production in this instance. But there are plenty of passages that talk about errors of quantity without attributing them to Africans in particular. And I've chosen more or less at random 3 examples from the collection of evidence that Mancini has produced in his recent article, in which he attempts to produce a particularly full collection of evidence of this kind. All of these passages are talking about barbarisms. In this text, we get the example, if you say the word repono with a long syllable first of all, and then a short one in the middle instead of the other way round. In this text, one example is if you say the word for Rome with a short O instead of a long one, and if you say the word for rose with a long O instead of a short one. And in this text, the example is if you say the word pernix for brisk with a long E instead of a short one. This one interests Mancini because that's a closed syllable. Now, all this discussion about errors of quantity would suggest, at first sight at least, that the system of distinctive quantities has been breaking down. And yet, something that worries me is if it's possible to produce an incorrect quantity, then it's also possible to produce a correct one. There's no point talking about an incorrect quantity unless there's some kind of difference you can hear between the correct one and the incorrect one. Now, there are various ways in which that could be true. It could be true because some remnant of the classical quantitative contrast is still there, even at this late date. It could be true if grammarians are keeping alive historical vowel quantities for learned purposes. But it's with the passages on the slide, it's difficult to be sure that the difference between the correct and the incorrect form necessarily resides in length itself. Consider, for example, this example, repono. The correct form and the incorrect form will differ in the position of the accent. What's being considered the correct form, where that middle vowel is being considered long, will have the accent on that vowel, whereas what's considered to be the incorrect form will have the accent on the first syllable, regardless of how those vowels are actually being pronounced. And all the examples in the passages on this slide have to do with O or E vowels. And as we've seen before, what's considered to be long O and what's considered to be short O are still distinct vowel sounds for most Latin speakers, even after the distinction in quantity itself has completely been lost, and the same with the E vowels. On that note, the texts that Mancini collects have an interesting property. Almost none of them concern A vowels, and A vowels are where we'd have a hope of knowing that length really means length, because there's no difference in quality between long and short a once the difference in quantity has been lost. I say almost none of the evidence of this type concerns a vowels, but there are two fairly well-known exceptions, and I'd like to take a look now at those. The first exception is Gellius on the pronunciation of the forms arctito and arctitavi, the frequentative arctito, those with ago, and its perfect tense arctitavi. He says he hears people getting the quantity of that first vowel wrong. It ought to be long, but he hears even quite educated people saying it as short, although they manage to get the quantity of the E in acito, which is long, and the long U in unctito, and the short I in dictito. They manage to get those things right. And Gellius says that in these frequentative forms, the rule is that the vowel in the root should have the same length as it has in the participle of the basic verb. So the long A in arctus should carry over to the frequentative arctito, but people are getting that wrong. Professor Loporcaro, following on from some earlier scholarship, suggests that it's relevant here that the vowel in question is an A. Is it the case that it's harder to hear the difference between a long and a short A if the distinction in length is on the way to getting lost, perhaps particularly in closed syllables, because there's no distinction in vowel quality between a long and a short A? And if that's the case, perhaps difficulty about hearing the difference between long and short A is also prompting people to be confused about which one they should be pronouncing. And I find that rather persuasive. But it's important that Gellius is hearing people pronounce a wrong quantity. And if it's possible to pronounce a wrong quantity, it should also be possible to pronounce a correct one. So there's some difference for Gellius and his audience between a long A and a short A in that position. Now, Gellius is quite early compared to our late antique texts. He's writing in the 2nd century AD, and at that date, I would find it the most plausible account of this evidence that we've actually still got a difference in length between long and short vowels, and it may be harder to hear for A than for the other vowels because it's only a distinction in length. You haven't got quality to help you as well, but there is still some difference in vowel quantity. The other exception is St. Augustine in Book 2 of the De Musica, composed sometime in the 380s AD. At the beginning of Book 2, the work takes the form of a dialogue between a teacher and a pupil, and at the beginning of the book, the teacher is wanting to get the pupil to understand the difference between long and short intervals of time that you can actually hear and ones that you need a grammarian to tell you about, because he wants the pupil to forget about the grammarians ones. He wants him to concentrate on ones that you can actually hear. And in order to set grammarians' notions of quantity to one side, he talks a bit about what the grammarians are up to. And in the passage I put on this slide, he says, I'd like you to know that the whole discipline, which is called grammatica in Greek, and interestingly literatura in Latin, practices the guarding of history. It's an entirely historical enterprise. And then he gives an example. He says, when you say, for example, the word cano, or you happen to place it in verse in such a way that either you make the first syllable of that word long in pronunciation, or you put it in a place in the verse where it should have been long, the grammarian, that guardian of history, will scold you, and he'll give no other reason why one ought to make that syllable short than that those who came before us and whose works survive and are handled by grammarians, those people make that syllable short and not long. So grammarians will scold you for making that syllable long, and their reason for doing so is a historical one. The ancients made it short, so it ought to be short. And he goes on to say that music doesn't care. If you want to make that syllable long for music, that's fine. It's not going to be offended in the least. But the grammarian will require it to be corrected and will require you to put a word whose first syllable ought to be produced long. again, on this historical basis, according to the authority of our ancestors. He goes on to do a little experiment with the pupil. He produces the first line of the Aeneid, firstly with the usual wording, ending with primus aboris, and then with a difference, he says primis aboris, and he asks the pupil if it makes a difference as far as the sound or the rhythm of the verse is concerned. And the pupil says no, they both sound the same. And then Augustine says, or the teacher, who I take it is channeling, Augustine says, oh, but that was a question of my pronunciation because I made a barbarism. I did something that the grammarians say is wrong, because the word primis ought to consist of 2 long syllables, but I made the second one short. And that's why your ears weren't offended. I went primis aboris, and that sounded okay. And he goes on to try the experiment again, but this time making an effort to pronounce the second syllable of primis long, so he goes primis aboris, and the pupil says, no, that time that sounds dreadful. Now, on the face of it, what can we get from Augustine's discussion? Grammarians, according to Augustine, keep historical vowel quantities alive, both for versification and for pronunciation. It's clear from other evidence as well that this is something they did for versification. They're interested in helping you understand classical verse forms and produce your own if you want to. But Augustine suggests that there's also keeping historical quantities alive for pronunciation. It's not just if you use the word cano when you're composing verse in such a way that you've put the first syllable in a position where it ought to be long, but also if you pronounce it like that. He says the grammarian will scold you. And then in his experiment with primis aboris, the second time he says it, where he makes that second syllable long, he suggests that that's what the grammarians tell us to do. And the example of cano is particularly interesting because that's an A vowel where length really ought to mean length because it can't mean vowel quality. And yet, I wonder how serious Augustine is when he talks about what the grammarians do here, the grammarians insisting on a short pronunciation. Because the whole point of Augustine's discussion here is he doesn't care about the grammarian's notion of length. He's only discussing it in order to set it to one side. Secondly, he's interested in duration as such. He's interested in actual literal length because he's writing about rhythm. All the 6 books of the De Musica that he actually got round to writing are about rhythm. And it's in that context that he insists that the grammarian's length is actual historical length. Or rather, that what it is a historical thing. He asks himself, what do the grammarians mean by length? And he says, oh, they mean that vowel used to be long. The ancients made it long. So to try to answer the question that I set out to answer, did the Roman authors on language do historical linguistics? Did Roman authors do historical linguistics in connection with vowel length? I think mostly not. I think mostly they did something else. But I think that Augustine in this passage does. He asks himself, what do grammarians mean by length? They mean something historical. They mean it used to be long. He suggests that the grammarians themselves do something similar with their pupils, that they keep alive or they revive historical vowel quantities on the basis, presumably, of the idea that length ought to mean length. And perhaps they did. I wouldn't want to rule that out. But I think the clearest instance we've got of somebody doing that is St. Augustine in this particular context, where he's interested in length meaning length because he's writing about rhythm. That's it. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much indeed. As with the first lecture, Philomena is happy to take questions. So you should feel free to ask questions either about this lecture or about both this and the first lecture, and to do so by using the reactions to raise your hand or by writing in the chat bar, and we will try and pick up your questions whichever means you take of trying to bring yourself to our attention. Who would like to ask Philomena about anything from this or the first lecture?
I can see a message saying Torsten Fergen has a question.
In that case, Torsten, do come in.
You can hear me. Thank you very much, Philomena, for this exciting lecture and also for the previous one. I have a very simple and straightforward question. To what extent is historical linguistics in antiquity connected to sociolinguistics? Because quite a lot of the documents that we've looked at concern questions related to norm or normative ideas. So, I mean, this is, of course, a topic for an altogether different lecture. Did the ancient Romans and the ancient Greeks do sociolinguistics? But I think it's a question that you can't even avoid in the context of your lecture. So I'm keen to learn a bit more from you about that.
Yes, yes. So I'm curious about this as well, and I suppose I'm cautious about assuming automatically that everything is normative. But I think Augustine, in the passage that we ended with just now, is certainly suggesting that what the grammarians are doing is something normative. I wonder how fairly he's representing the grammarians there, whether, and you know, his idea that they guard the history of the language is they're the guardians of history, is often quoted as if that's straightforwardly what they're doing. I wonder to what extent they might have said, hang on, what we're doing is a bit more subtle than that, in the way that, you know, Oxford colleagues who work on the OED are often told that the OED is the guardian of the English language, and they say, hang on a bit, we're trying to do a descriptive dictionary. So I'm not sure. I mean, I'm not saying it isn't normative. Clearly there is normative stuff going on, and clearly some of the contexts in which there's a possibility that somebody's reviving a historical quantity, particularly if they're actually getting people to pronounce it that way. That's certainly what Augustine is suggesting the grammarians do. If the grammarians do that, then yes, they're doing something normative and rather interesting. It's not just saying this is the high register way to pronounce the word. This is a really weird way to pronounce the word, and we're going to do it because we know from the whole history of how we talk about Latin that these vowels ought to be long. Not sure how much that answers your question, but no, I think that's a super good question.
Thank you very much.
Can I ask you a related social question about the Africans? So do you think that the Africans are being picked out here as a matter of, you can tell who's from the province of Africa because they're black, as it were, whereas you can't necessarily tell whether they're from Germany or Gaul or wherever. Why might it be African?
Why might it be Africans in particular? So I think that has been suggested, that this is a sort of trope. But if Jim Adams is right, he has argued that the vowels merged in a different way in Africa from what happened in most areas. And he argues that on the basis of a lack of the type of orthographic mistakes that we get in most other places that show that, for example, long E and short I have merged with each other. And if that's true, then I think there may be more to it than that. It may not just be a trope, it may be partly a trope, but I think there may be a linguistic basis to it as well.
David. When you can find your unmute button.
Yes. Can you hear me?
We can.
Philomena, thank you very much indeed for both lectures. Your Gellius passage, Arctitawi, why does he bring in the perfect form where the stress is on the penultimate syllable? Is it simply to make clear what form of the verb he's talking about? the other examples that he gives of the frequentative are just first person singular present, aren't they? Ercito, unctito.
True. Yes. Yes.
So that
I don't know.
you have the stress there. It's a tiny point, just puzzles me slightly because it risks muddying the water.
Yes. Yes.
Or can we infer that he was so careful in his pronunciation to pronounce even the first syllable of Arctitawi as distinctively long?
Or is it, I haven't thought about this, but or is it that it's actually there that he's particularly hearing the mistake? If that's where it gets most muddled up in practice, it has been suggested, and I can't remember where now, that one possibility about how Latin accent was realized is that the distinction between long and short vowels was clearer in accented syllables than in unaccented ones. And if something like that's true, even along with other things potentially, then I suppose it could be that if he's hearing people getting a quantity wrong, maybe that's more likely to happen, especially if getting it wrong is related to having difficulty hearing it in the first place. I don't know.
Right. Yes.
I don't know.
Yes.
Yeah, good, very good question. Yes.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Nick.
Thanks very much. First of all, I should just say that my daughter is here with me, and she's just been having a tantrum. So if you hear noises coming from her, I apologise. Thanks for all your talks and seminars, Philemon. I've really enjoyed them, and I guess one of the things that I've taken from them is that we should really come to grammarians kind of from their perspective and try and really understand what they're interested in and what they're talking about. And I was wondering if you think that we tend too much to come to them in terms of what we're interested in, and that actually we're sort of not exactly too trusting of the grammarians, but we tend to want to fit them into what we want to know about.
I think that's probably true. I mean, I think it's inevitable. Of course, we approach everything in connection with what we're interested in. I suppose I find it a particularly interesting challenge when ideally we would like to understand what's going on in the history of the vowel length system in order to understand what the grammarians are doing, but we'd also ideally like to be able to understand the grammarians first in order to understand what they're telling us about the vowel length system. So I suppose that's something that I'm interested in, but makes it, I think, valuable even for being able to ultimately get somewhere with those kinds of questions, to try to understand them as best we can on their own terms. I'm not sure that's a particular answer to your question, but I think a certain degree of that is inevitable. We of course are interested in particular things.
So we have a question in the chat bar from Caroline Lewis. Is there any evidence of an interest in variants across the Roman world other than Africa and Sardinia as the forms of Latin begin to diverge into Romance languages?
Ooh, there is interest. I'm not aware of much in connection with vowel quantity, but there are certainly comments on the Latin of people from different parts of the empire, and Jim Adams' Regional Diversification of the Latin Language has I think a chapter devoted to that. But yes, there are some comments, often a bit hard for us to interpret. Spanish speakers have a very sort of full pronunciation of their vowel sounds or something, if I remember rightly. And yes, exactly what that means about their pronunciation is another matter.
Is there anyone else who would like to ask a question before we finish? Pavel, to come in.
Well, first of all, thank you for the great lectures. It was very pleasant and useful to hear, and greetings from St. Petersburg.
Oh,
and
greetings to St. Petersburg.
My classes is from St. Petersburg. To the question is, there is a question why, which is considered naive, counterproductive in modern day linguistics. Did you ever happen to run across some notion of why, for example, why long vowels, long by nature and by what is deemed traditionally right, had become short by ancient grammarians?
I'm not sure if I've understood your question, but sorry, is your question, have I come across ancient grammarians talking about why the quantity changed?
Exactly, yes.
No, I haven't. And in a way that doesn't surprise me, because most of the time they talk about quantity as if nothing has changed. Even when they're recognizing that we need some hints about how to know the quantity, they don't say, and the reason we have difficulty is quantity is a historical thing. I think most of the time it's as if they think that's just how it always was. Augustine gives it this historical spin, and I find it very interesting that he does that, and I think he does that because of his interest in rhythm in that work, that he's interested in literal length, but I don't think that's what's mostly going on in the grammatical tradition, and therefore, because I don't think there's very much recognition, certainly explicit recognition, that how quantities were pronounced was once different, it would then be a further step from that to say, and why has that change happened?
I want to ask because there is a thought of the sort in Cratylus, where Socrates says that that names which are right by nature, καταφύσιν,
yes,
are changed among people. Euphonias γένεκα or καλαπίσματος γένεκα. We wanted to sound different, and the change is voluntary.
Yes. I can't think of anything similar. I mean, there are comments in Varro on things changing over time and the etymology becoming less clear, but I can't, there may be examples, but not that I can think of, in which a reason is given why change happens.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Can I, at this point, warmly thank everybody who has attended this lecture, and I hope that you have enjoyed the possibility of being at least briefly in Cambridge, in a very funny sense of in, but we are above all grateful to Philomena for two wonderful examples of pedagogy, and many of us have been taken to places we've never visited before and made to think about questions that we had never dreamed of even of asking. We are most grateful to you for doing this, and particularly for doing this in these very strange circumstances. And we look forward to a moment when we can celebrate these lectures by having you actually physically among us. Instead of which, I'm afraid that in the rather strange way of Zoom lectures, all that will happen now is that you will be unceremoniously booted from the screen as if you're an unwanted member of a parish council. But thank you very warmly indeed.
Thank you very much.
Good night to everybody.
Thank you.